no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, UnSpun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to UnSpun today. UnSpun, because you deserve the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of UnSpun. Before we get into this week's episode, I'd like to start with a message from the President of the United States.
What a stupid son.
No, wait, not that president. We'll get back to him in a minute. First, here was a very recent statement by our current president.
And we had a deal. I was going there, and I didn't want to go during the war. I said, look, we have a thing called a war, or as they would rather say, a military operation. This is for legal reasons. I say military because as a military operation, I don't need any approvals. As a war, you're supposed to get approval from Congress, something like that. So I call it a military operation.
Trump's reframing of the word war as military action is an example of a logical trick that we've talked about on the pod before. He's using equivocation. Equivocation is where you're using your words in a way where their literal meaning might be correct, but the way that you're using them suggests it means something opposite. You have that in the opening of the podcast, where Bill Clinton is talking about what the meaning of the word is. Clearly deceptive, right? And you have it here from President Trump, who may not be intending to, but is saying that when he says military action, he secretly means war. Equivocation is just a verbal trick where you try to get yourself out of trouble, in this case by not asking Congress for a declaration of war, by saying words don't mean what you actually do intend for them to mean. Okay, so let's go back to that clip from the beginning. Here it is again.
What a stupid son.
This is an example of a hot mic moment. This is where someone is having their words recorded or amplified, and they don't know that it's happening. So in some sense, maybe you're hearing what they really think rather than what they would say to an audience. In this case, Biden is calling Fox News reporter Peter Doocy a little b. Here's the context. This happened at the White House, and it was a meeting about inflation. Leading up to elections, prices had gone up quite a bit, and this was becoming a big election issue. The reporters are in the process of getting pushed out of the room, staff's asking them to leave, and Peter Doocy throws out one last question. He says, quote, "Do you think inflation is a political liability going into the midterms?" Biden replies with a kind of a sarcastic remark, "A great asset, more inflation." He probably believes after this that his mic had been cut off, and that's when he says that Doocy is a not nice word. It's not very long, and he doesn't think people will hear it, but it was one of those hot mic moments. The clip starts circulating right away. ABC has an official transcript that includes the full remark. It shows up on loop on some cable networks, and there's headlines that lock onto the quote itself, replacing the ITCH part of the last word with asterisks. There's a big polarized reaction right away. The House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy calls the comment unpresidential and says that Biden doesn't respect the press. And at the same time, some Democratic allies downplay it as just being a human moment, adding that Biden later called Doocy to say he was sorry and that the remark was made from frustration, not intended to be insulting. Notice, though, that the original topic, inflation, has disappeared. What we're all talking about is the bad word. His statement is replayed and repeated because it feels like it's capturing something behind the scenes, right? Something real. And it turns out that this is a pattern that shows up kind of frequently. You've got that single line that breaks expectations and it pulls everything away from the substance and redirects it towards someone's tone or their personality. And eventually the reaction becomes the whole story. So here's a question: why does a moment like this take over so completely? And I also wonder if it happens beyond politics. To find out, let's get unspun. If we go back to October of 2016, just weeks before another election, there was a recording from the set of Access Hollywood. Donald Trump is speaking off camera on a bus, and he doesn't know that audio is being recorded and going to become public as he describes interactions with women in explicit terms. Have a listen.
I got to use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't need to wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything, whatever you want.
Now, this clip also spreads almost instantly. In fact, some TV networks interrupted their coverage to air the tape. First, it showed up in full and then in fragments as part of endless discussions on nighttime panel shows. Headlines would repeat the quote of "you can grab them by a nickname," because it was the quote itself that drew attention. So again, the story quickly changed from any issues Trump was campaigning on to more about what this stolen moment revealed about the candidate. And again, there was an immediate reaction. House Speaker Paul Ryan called the comments sickening, and he said women should not be objectified. Senator Kelly Ayotte said she was completely disturbed and would not be supporting Trump. And a former Secretary of State said that Donald Trump should not be president. And as the story continued, it turned into one about how the remarks played politically. Some Republican figures qualified their criticism, and particularly among Republican women, the response split up in some ways that became part of coverage itself. Some women saying that the remarks were disqualifying, but others, including the future First Lady, calling it locker room talk, some crude but familiar ways that men just communicate with each other, apparently. It was a partisan response. At the same time, Democratic figures framed the tape as evidence of Trump's character, and there was a whole parade of expert commenters on TV news shows talking about broader questions about gender and power. And again, we had stopped talking about issues. But that clip really had legs. Years later, you can find that same clip showing up on platforms like TikTok, where younger audiences are finding it for the first time. These are people who were maybe not paying attention to the news in 2016 because they were 8-year-old children, but are now adults who can vote. And so the election really narrowed around that recording. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about what's good for the country. It was about that clip. And that's where this pattern becomes even clearer. What's happening isn't just outrage or controversy. It's a predictable effect of political communication interacting with attention. And there's been quite a lot of studies of political language that consistently find that this kind of vulgar speech, cursing, this uncivil way of talking, it gets more engagement, gets more likes, gets more shares, and it gets more media coverage than policy debates do. When you violate social norms, it doesn't just grab attention, it dominates. And researchers have noticed that it will get people talking about candidates in new places, like inside people's own social media accounts. But at the same time, that attention isn't neutral. The same body of research shows that although talking like this can make you visible in the short term, the attention isn't always helpful because it can make you seem less trustworthy. So the system rewards the moment, even though people might reject what was said. And that creates a kind of a momentum. Once a clip gets picked up, every reaction, whether it's praise or criticism, it keeps it going and it gives it new life. When people try to contextualize it, it keeps the idea out there. And so that single remark becomes a whole cycle that favors what's immediate and emotional and easy to pass along. But at the same time, substantive messages struggle in the same kinds of systems. Your complicated policy discussion takes time and attention, which does not fit into a buzzy headline that's going to get clicks. So in a crowded information environment where people have way too many things to pay attention to, the first step is not to be understood, it's to be seen. Attention alone isn't the whole story, though. If profanity just got attention, it would fade as quick as it shows up, but that's not what happens. Because when politicians use language that breaks norms, people don't just hear words. They interpret what the words mean about the person who's saying them. And this interpretation can cause some real divisions. There's examples all over the world. In the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte built part of his political identity around using a lot of profanity in his speeches and in his press appearances. For example, he used the same term to refer to President Barack Obama that Joe Biden did for Peter Doocy. And it ended up getting some official meetings canceled. Duterte's critics called it reckless and inappropriate, but his supporters saw it as evidence that he wasn't constrained by diplomatic norms, and he was willing to speak bluntly in a way that other leaders were afraid to. In Indonesia, the governor of Jakarta, known as Ahok, would refer to corrupt officials in very blunt and insulting terms. And in that context, a lot of times the audience heard that language positively because it was matched by actual actions. And in the US, of course, that has showed up quite a bit as well. You can think of how George W. Bush used to give people somewhat insulting nicknames, and that's gone to a much higher level with Donald Trump, who uses insults like Lion Ted as repeated labels that are trying to define his opponents in simple, insulting terms. His supporters see this as refreshing, right? That he's rejecting that careful political language. But other people see it as degrading and harmful. So you've got the same words, but they're building connection with one audience and making another distrust you. And that divide is kind of predictable. Research on political language shows that when politicians use profanity, it's persuasive in a complex way. It's through perception. Studies have found that swearing makes the audience think you're more authentic, and that can make them like you more if they value that trait. At the same time, the same words will make you seem less trustworthy for audiences who expect you to be civil when you talk. And this creates a kind of moral disapproval that can make people less interested in you over time. So I guess the takeaway here is that the effect is just segmented. What's important to remember is that the reactions don't depend as much on the words themselves as they do on what the audience already believes. Research shows that some voters view disrespect as a necessary evil in politics because it's a sign that the candidate is willing to aggressively challenge norms. So for voters, those voters anyway, profanity reinforces credibility because it signals strength and independence. But for others, that profanity violates their expectations about professionalism, which makes the speaker seem incompetent or less serious. So politicians have a decision to make. Can they afford to alienate one audience while they mobilize another? If so, that language becomes useful, not just despite its divisiveness, but because of it. And if you listen to how a politician uses language like that, it tells you which audience they are aligned with. And once that alignment, the idea that the politician is one of us, is set, the words themselves aren't as important as what they signal. It's not showing just language, but it's showing identity. Before we move on, I need to take a quick break. But when I come back, we'll look at the question of whether this kind of strategy works over time. I'll be right back. Welcome back. So we've talked about how choosing vulgar language can be a good strategy if the audience that you want to reach is going to value straightforwardness or if they feel like they're part of your community when you use it. Whether that effect lasts over time turns out to be more complex. The same research that shows how profanity attracts attention and feels authentic shows that those gains come with costs, and sometimes those costs are slow to show up. In the short term, profanity increases your engagement pretty reliably, right? You get more reactions and more shares, and the news covers you more, and you're more visible across platforms. But over longer periods of time, those effects kind of diverge. We've got several types of stories. Acting in an uncivil way makes people think of you as less trustworthy, and sometimes that shift in perception means that people don't just disagree with you, but over time they just start to ignore you. So you've got a loss of trust that's not distributed evenly through the public. Those who are already maybe inclined to disagree with the person who's being uncivil are more likely to take the language offensively. So essentially, what you're seeing is a choice to trade off trust from some groups for just attention from others. And if you're in a really polarized environment, which describes a lot of places right now, that can be a good strategy. That's because to succeed politically doesn't require that everybody love you. Instead, you have to get enough of a group together to outweigh the people who might oppose you. So you can use language to sharpen division, and it can actually serve that goal. It does make it easier to get elected, but it may make it harder to govern later when people don't trust you. And the interesting thing is that the effects don't just stop at individuals. It starts shaping the whole information environment, and I think that's where we find ourselves today. Researchers have found that this exists at the system level. In places where you have more politicians using profanity and being vulgar, you also tend to have higher levels of polarization in that society. You'll find that people have a harder time agreeing on what good ways for us to live with each other actually are. When this language becomes common, it doesn't just reflect division, it helps to normalize it. And it changes the way we expect political actors to speak. And sometimes that moves beyond just perceptions. For example, one study found that derogatory talk from political leaders was related to measurable increases in violence against women after broadcasts happened. And this really suggests that language at the top can influence ordinary people's behaviors. So the signal doesn't stay contained inside the political message, but it moves outward. And this is because every curse, every clip, every time we talk a lot and share messages about what this person said and whether it was right or wrong, it all contributes to a gradual shift in what we would consider to be normal. And that creates a disconnect. What works for politicians, which is capturing the attention and ginning up support, doesn't actually work for the systems that politicians later operate in. So the effects don't just stay in the moment, but they carry forward into the next one. Here's another example.
Donald Trump. He's a jagoff.
That was John Fetterman. In 2022, Fetterman ran for Senate in Pennsylvania, and his campaign style included very blunt wording. In both what he wore and in the way he talked, he rejected the polish you would usually expect of a national level candidate. But this actually traced back years earlier. In 2016, while Fetterman was just a mayor, he was asked about Donald Trump's proposed ban on Muslims who wanted to enter the United States. And he had replied by calling Trump a, quote, jagoff. Now, I didn't grow up in Pennsylvania, but I did grow up in the Northeast, and I can tell you that people who used that word when I was in elementary school often got sent to the office to have a talk with the principal because it was considered inappropriate language for school. It was interesting because Fetterman's campaign didn't walk that statement back, but instead leaned into it. The campaign issued a one-sentence press release, quote, "I called Trump a jagoff," which is Western Pennsylvania for jerk. And then it turned the phrase into merch. They had a great campaign t-shirt that they sold that had the message in bold block letters, "Trump is a jagoff," and underneath there was the hashtag Team Fetterman. The design was simple. I think it was almost intentionally not polished looking. And that showed that the insult was not a mistake, but it was a message. And this language hung on for a while. In September of 2023, because he was eventually elected as a senator, Fetterman used the same term talking to reporters during a government shutdown standoff. Fetterman wanted to wear casual clothes on the Senate floor and was criticized for that. And he said, quote, "If those jagoffs in the House stop trying to shut our government down and fully support Ukraine, I will save democracy by wearing a suit on the Senate floor." He was being sarcastic at this time. And the reaction was split again. Some people treated it as just what you'd expect, direct, informal, and not worried at all about being politically nice. But that wasn't everyone. A constituent named Marcia Cohen wrote to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette saying, quote, "As a Pittsburgher and a Pennsylvanian, I'm ashamed of Senator John Fetterman." She was arguing that the language gave negative stereotypes and showed that he didn't respect the office that he held. Fetterman's wording hadn't changed, but the context sure had. He went from being a small-town mayor to the Senate and from outsider to office holder. And so when the context changed, the interpretation changed with it. And I think that's an example of the kind of trade-off we look at. The words haven't changed, but the meaning has shifted. And the research is pretty consistent about this. There's this uneven effect where the same moment will draw some people in, but also push others away. So what begins as a communication tactic for an individual becomes something bigger when it moves to the system. Because every clip and every snide remark and every cycle of outrage shows a gradual shift in what becomes acceptable. What works for the politician is getting that attention and mobilizing those supporters, but it doesn't always work for the system because the norms change and the trust gets fragmented. And those effects hang around after the people who use bad language do. I need to take one more very quick break, but when I come back, we'll talk about how using vulgar language can actually affect the way the audience hears you. Because boy, politicians do take advantage of that. I'll be right back. Welcome back. So we've talked about the accumulation of attention and the fragmentation of trust in the way it changes what feels normal. But it's also important to know that as certain kinds of language become effective at capturing attention, they start to crowd the information environment. What do I mean by this? The thing that made that single remark get noticed continues to get noticed with other remarks. Politicians, therefore, have to up the ante and become more vulgar to continue to attract that attention, because the norm has shifted and some vulgarity has become normal. So when you have a moment like Biden's hot mic comment or the Access Hollywood tape, it does more than generate reactions. It kind of changes people's focus, right? Because people are talking about tone and personality and interpretation. And eventually, people start thinking that the loudest person with the snappiest comebacks is also the best person. And this can be a deliberate strategy. Research on political communication shows that when people use that kind of language, it does make people more likely to react, but it also makes them think less well. It makes them less likely to engage in substantive thinking. In other words, the things that make a message more attractive also make everything around it boring. And when it's insults and cursing that are attractive, we lose our ability to talk about policy. A detailed and complicated policy, like how we're going to manage healthcare in a large and diverse country, is really tough to summarize in a bullet point, and you can't put it in a soundbite, and you can't really spread it around without taking it out of its context. So those single provocative sentences move across the platforms intact, and algorithms will tend to favor those instead of substantive discourse. And the audience has also changed. Over time, what people will remember from political exchanges is not the quality of a prospective leader's thought, and more likely to be the reaction that they got for what they said. People will actually say, "We don't need somebody who's good at this job. We just need somebody who's willing to fight." The meaning gets displaced there, and what we're left with is political talk that becomes organized around attention-getting moments rather than ideas. So if you want to succeed in this world, your incentives are now different. If the moments that break through and capture that attention cycle are the ones that provoke, the ones that are vulgar, the curse words, those are the ones you're going to do. Politicians learn this, media systems reinforce it, and the audience responds to it. And eventually we get stuck in this feedback loop that gradually redefines how we think about effective communication. So over time, the question isn't really why politicians use this kind of language, it's what this kind of language is replacing. We're not just hearing more vulgarity, we are also hearing less of everything else. And this is a pattern that shows up across countries and political systems and even ideologies. The specific words may change and so might the contexts, but the underlying dynamic is consistent. In a crowded information environment where every message is competing for very limited attention, the first barrier is not being accurate, it's being noticed. And because attention is what you want, successful messages move really quickly and they don't require that context. What used to feel shocking starts feeling familiar. And that's where the question comes for us truth seekers. It's not so much why politicians swear, but it's what we do when they do. Because the system runs on attention, this is a choice that you and I have. You can pause before you react and think about what it is that's making you want to react. You can ask what the context was. What was the question that was going on before that moment took over? You can go back and find the full exchange instead of relying on those people who make their living clipping out those hot button moments to share on social media. These are small choices you can make, but they do matter. The system follows attention, and attention follows behavior. So what we choose to engage with is what we're going to get more of. If we keep amplifying the hot takes, that's what we're going to keep getting. And that's probably not going to help us do better. That's it for this episode of UnSpun. Thank you for hanging in with me, truth seekers. You know I appreciate you. Stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Our democracy is hanging by a thread, but we know it's not about just winning and losing each battle. It's about persistence and building resilience.
That's why we're launching the Practivist Pod, the practice of activism made practical.
If you're looking for ways to get engaged or just for ways to stay sane, we want to help you navigate what comes next.
It's an exciting collaboration with political dynamo Jess Craven, author of the Chop Wood, Carry Water newsletter,
and grassroots activist Steve Pearson, host of the How We Win podcast.
Every week on the Practivist Pod, we're going to have important conversations with changemakers, give you practical ways to make an impact, have some fun, and inspire hope.
This is more than a podcast. It's a place for our community to grow our practice of advocacy for justice, equity, and progress.
Action is the best antidote for anxiety, so subscribe to the Practivist Pod today.